I got turned on to the idea of Christian apologetics when I was in Bible college, and I read the book by Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and the thought had never entered my mind that there was a question about the historicity of the resurrection or the credibility of the Bible. You know, I'd grown up in a Christian environment and everything was assumed and never challenged, and saw no reason for a challenge. But when I read the book, I realized the Christian faith is based on historical evidence, and the Christian faith is validated by thousands of years of changed lives. And so I got interested in apologetics, but after we finished college, and my wife and I, Carol, were married, in our first apartment, we were visited frequently by Jehovah's Witnesses. And the first couple of times I came up on the short end of the stick talking with them, and I thought, well, that's an area of apologetics, so I should study that. So I went to the Christian bookstore and I got a book and I read it, and next time they came by, they ended up on the short end of the stick because I had some questions that they couldn't answer. And so when they came up on the short end of the stick, they said, we'll bring an elder with us who's more well-versed than us, and you can ask your questions to him. So they did, and he couldn't answer them, and he said, I'll send a brother who is more well-versed than he is. So this was just really exciting. I was putting elders back on their heels, and, you know, that's fun. In our line of work, it's kind of fun to do that. Of course, ultimately, when your interest turns into a burden, it's not fun to just win an argument. It's fulfilling to see them give their lives to Christ. But my interest in Jehovah's Witnesses turned to a burden when we were at the first meeting that we went to at a Kingdom Hall. And what I saw there was a spiritual version of zombies. They were moving around in physical bodies, but there was no life in them. And that's when I realized I've got to do something. But whenever, and this is my life pattern, whenever I've gotten interested in something, or obsessive or passionate, whatever term you want to use, I would want to gather people around me to enjoy it with me. I've done that with soccer teams, and I've done that with car clubs, and I've done that with ministries, and so that's my pattern of life. And so I began searching the entire country to find other people with a similar interest or burden. One of the people I found was Jim Valentine and the Karis people out in California. And I sent a letter out to them that I had gotten back from the Watchtower questioning them on John 1:1. And they called me one night and said that you've uncovered another nail in the coffin for Jehovah's Witnesses. And oh, I was excited to hear that. What's this? They misquoted Dr. Philip Herner, a Greek scholar, on John 1:1. And so, you know, I was at first base now and running the bases. So over time, the Lord sent people to me. I didn't go out and find them. The Lord sent them to me who seemed to be the kind of people that would want to serve the Lord in this kind of ministry. And eventually we ended up, at one point I think in our history, we had 8 offices around the country and a couple overseas. And we had around 35 to 40 staff, full-time, part-time. And the saying was, resistance is futile, you will be absorbed. But y'all are kind of late to the Star Wars or Star Trek genre, I guess. But the thing that happened to me that is my subject this afternoon, I had studied the Phariseeism of the cults, how they control their people. I could spell it out to you. I could describe it to you. I could take you through John 23 and point out how when Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, I could say this is exactly what JWs and Mormons and others do. But I didn't realize I was a frog in a kettle of legalism at the church that I was in at the time. And the influence going on there was the Institute in Basic Life Principles, Bill Gothard. And it led to a clash. And humanly speaking, I was the loser in this. And the things that I was pointing out to them as abusive, they were rejecting. And I was wondering, how can godly men, the elders of this church, not see through what I'm telling them? And this, I won't go into the spiritual abuse, but it hit me hard because I was emotionally and spiritually at a low point, and I was struggling, and then this came down on my shoulders. And so it impacted me far more than it would you or anyone else. And the thing that happened in the middle of that, Dan and Debbie Dykstra sent me The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse by Jeff Van Vonderen and David Johnson. And I was reading through that, and oh, this really applies to this situation, or this really applies to that situation. I was underlining, I was making notes in the margin as to how it applied. And when I finished that book, I realized the problem is there in the system, it's not here. And I was liberated. I knew the truth, and now I was set free. And I ordered a bunch of copies and gave them to the elders of the church and some others, and became a problem person for them. But that was the mid-90s, and it opened my eyes to the kind of situation that can creep into Orthodox Christian settings. And so I began to read all the books that I could get, including Jeff Van Vonderen's. I had the opportunity to work with him in one intervention some years after that. But you can still watch him on the A&E intervention program. He's still living on the air in A&E. But all of this information I had about spiritual abuse, I was thinking of a way of using this with the Jehovah's Witnesses. One of the things that Dan Dykstra had said to me is that spiritual abuse control methodologies are the lingua franca of all of the cults, the language of commerce. They all use these methods, and they don't know that they're using the dark side of the force, so to speak, but they are. And so I was thinking in terms of how I could use this with JWs, like give them a copy of Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse and tell them, read this, it's all about our problems. Oh yeah, they'll want to read that, but then they'll see themselves in the mirror. And so there's a place for that. If you can get a JW to read about our problems and its spiritual abuse, they will see the control mechanisms in their own system. But then I got a phone call one night from a lady in Noonan, Georgia, and she was describing a situation in her church that was probably illegal, but certainly unethical and immoral. But I asked her, is this a pattern or is this just a single thing? Oh, no, it's a pattern. The pastor of this church does all kinds of things like this, violating tax law and things like that, giving favored people favored treatment and so on. And I talked to her about other people like her who were seeing this kind of thing, and she said, yes, there's a number of people. And I said, about how many? Oh, a couple dozen maybe. And I said, could you get them together in a private home, a neutral location, and I'll come up and talk with them. And so that was arranged. And Carol and I arrived there, and when we went in, we saw the people already there, and there was a bit of a look of apprehension on everyone's face. They didn't know what the evening held. They didn't know if they were in trouble because they were going to be reported back to their pastor. They didn't know if I was going to come down on them for believing or participating in such a thing. All kinds of things can go through the mind of someone in their situation. And as other people came, the same look of apprehension. And I had learned in dealing with the cults that you don't tell a Jehovah's Witness, you're in a cult, because immediately the wall goes up. And so what I decided to do was to talk about the characteristics of any abusive group without naming any particular group. And the people hearing me talk about it would know that it's any and all of the groups that are abusive use these methods. And I'm not talking about their particular church. And so I developed a concept of a pyramid for all the abuse type issues. At the base is legalism, a performance-based relationship with God. And out of this, you get tired people. People get on the treadmill thinking that they're going to perform up to standard and please the Lord. The Lord will then smile on them, and then they will move up to the next level of spiritual maturity. And so the person gets on the trail to this higher path, and they're going for a while, and they decide to step off the path and make an assessment, and they do that, and they look around. The scenery hasn't changed. They're where they started. And so they realize, well, you know, I was sloughing it off a little bit. I can do a little better. So they get back on the path, and they are moving at a fast pace, a fast walk kind of pace, and they tire out after a while. Okay, well, I want to see what kind of progress I've made. So they step off the path, and they look around, and the scenery has not changed. Well, I'm going to sprint this time, full speed, and they get back on the path, and they're going full speed. And, of course, they tire out very quickly. They step off the path. They look around. The scenery has not changed. They walk away. They don't get back on the path. And as I'm telling you this, I have a particular person in mind in that church that we were in who did exactly that thing. He was a very strong, mature Christian to outward appearance, but he was on a treadmill. He was not on a path of spiritual growth. And when he tired out, he walked away. And it's common. Just think through your experience of people who have been with you in whatever religious background, Jehovah's Witness, Christian church, whatever, that some people are gung-ho for the Lord and then they disappear. What happened to them? Well, they've gone off into the world. So that's the kind of story that you'll hear frequently because of this performance-based relationship with God. We think that God will love us more because we perform our best for Him. No. At the time that we are born again, we have all the love of God that we will ever have. What He wants is more of us in intimate fellowship. He wants to do all of those good things through us, not getting us to do them, but to give us the strength, the will, the leading, and the power to do it. It's not on our basis or our strength, because we will end up on a treadmill and we'll end up walking away. So that foundation of legalism is necessary for spiritual abuse to gain root. And so spiritual abuse is the next level of the pyramid. And this is when the legalism becomes oppressive from the top down. It's not just the person in the pew hearing performance. And here's a point. A person who comes from a shame-based identity can be in a church hearing a pastor preach about grace, how God wants to give you His salvation as a free gift, and the person will hear, God wants me to perform. He wants me to do more. It's interesting psychologically how that twist can take place in a person's mind and heart. But it's a shame-based identity that is fertile ground for this. And so in spiritual abuse, when I get a phone call from someone who talks about their toxic church, their abusive or controlling pastor, I have a list on a little sheet of paper next to my computer that as they're talking, I'll say, is the person authoritarian, the leader of the church? Oh, yes, very much. Do they assign blame to people? And especially, do they do it publicly? Yeah, they do that. I go through a list of about 10 characteristics, and the person is telling me yes, yes, yes. And at the end of that, I tell them, you're agreeing with me in what authors and specialists in this field call a system of control. And you're in a system that is causing you to call me because you've recognized a problem and you need help. You need to separate yourself from that system. And so I'll go ahead and finish on the capstone of the pyramid, and that's mind control. At this level, it's you drink the Kool-Aid if they tell you to. But all of these, from legalism, spiritual abuse, to mind control, they all involve essentially the same characteristics. The difference is in degree. And at the capstone, the mind control, it's the most severe. And there are a number of cults out there that are specialists in this. Now, I got a very interesting, oh, wait a minute, I didn't tell you about the Noonan story. I didn't finish that. So we went there, and I was going through the legalism characteristics, and I told the people, if something is familiar, you can talk about a situation in your experience that fits that characteristic, raise your hand and tell us about it. We went through most of the characteristics of legalism, and no one raised their hand. I thought, we're going to be finished in 30 minutes. And finally, near the end of the legalism characteristics, one person raised their hand cautiously, and the floodgates opened. And 3 hours later, everybody was smiling, everybody was laughing. There was a joy in their eyes because what had they learned? You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The problem was there, not here. And so one of the things that I had required of the people there is, I want you to raise your hand and promise before the Lord that anything that anyone here says will stay in this group. You can talk with someone in this group elsewhere, but not someone elsewhere who's not in this group. And everybody agreed to that, except one who agreed later ratted out and went to the pastor and spilled the beans. And the pastor hunted me down at one of my speaking engagements. And I thought he was going to interrupt the speaking engagement, but he held his fire. He met me in the parking lot afterwards, and I basically gave him the stiff arm. He didn't have my respect. I had heard a lot of things that this man had done that were illegal, unethical, certainly not gracious as a minister of the gospel would be. And he wanted a copy of my file on him and his church. I said, I don't have a file on you, but I may. And so anyway, I just refused to let him get to first base on anything. This man, in order to confront one of his members, went to his place of employment and asked to see him so he could confront him about his sin on the employer's time. That's what I say. It's just unethical and improper. The next call I got, well, it wasn't a call, it was an email. A lady in Baltimore called me about her husband. She had come to the conclusion that Greater Grace World Outreach was not a gracious church. And how many have heard of Greater Grace World Outreach? Yeah, several. And founded by Carl Stevens, started out as the Bible Speaks in Massachusetts and Maine, and because of losing a court case and all their money, they changed their name and moved to Baltimore. And Carl Stevens was growing older, and he was basically out of the pulpit at the time I got this call from this lady. And she said, I've concluded that this group operates like a cult. Its doctrine is orthodox, but they operate like a cult. And I asked her for examples, and she said, I want to get my husband out. He's an associate staff at the church. And I said, okay, you're going to have to do something that is unusual. You can't just talk to him and try and persuade him. Get the book, Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. Go through it and underline things, make notes in the margin as it applies to greater grace. And when you're finished, leave it on the coffee table. A little landmine out there. 5 weeks later, I got a message back from her. She said, it worked, he's out. So that's a good idea, you know, if you want to help someone like that. But then she said, we have family and friends who are still in, and how do we get them out? And I said, well, you're going to have to think outside the box. Walking up and down the sidewalk out in front with a picket sign is not going to do any good at all. You're not going to do any good by accusing them of anything, because it will raise that defensive wall. I'm thinking back to what I had concluded with what I did with the group in Noonan. And I was wanting to coach her in a way that would point her in that same general direction. And I said, think outside the box, come up with a plan, and let me know, and I'll see if I can help you with that. She called back later and said, you know, I was the secretary who entered all the data for the membership of the church, and we've got 600 names and addresses, and we're going to send out a postcard, and we're going to talk to them about a discussion on the internet at a particular website that already had 6 comments going back years before about Greater Grace World Outreach. And we're going to ask people to come here and talk about these issues that we're identifying in this postcard. And we'll also send them to your spiritual abuse hotline. And my hotline ran off the hook. And that website was started to deal with Scientology, and at the time they had about 35,000 posts relative to Scientology. In 2 years, Greater Grace went to about 90,000, with 2 other websites also doing discussion format kind of things. And I saw the people involved in this discussion forum falling into 3 categories. You had the loyal defender of Carl Stevens and Greater Grace. You had the dissidents who had seen through it early on, and their number was growing as the discussion caused people in the middle to choose sides. And then you had this lurking community in the middle that had not announced themselves one way or another. But in about 2 years' time, the whole Greater Grace denomination, and there was about 20,000 people worldwide in the Greater Grace denomination, about 100 churches besides the Baltimore Mother Church, and about 600 people who were either missionaries, pastors, or Bible teachers around the world trying to establish churches. They had the Maryland Bible College and Seminary. They had a Christian school connected with the church. And so they were full plan organization covering the whole spectrum, and it all imploded. And about 90% of the member churches split and formed the International Association of Grace Ministries. The numbers in Baltimore went down precipitously, and with it the money that they brought to the church. I got a call from one of the pastors who said, I don't think that I can lead my people anymore, because I was preaching the kind of control and shame-based identity kind of things that I learned from Greater Grace. And I said, you know those things are wrong and why they're wrong? He said, yeah. I said, you know how to preach grace from here on out? He said, yeah. I said, you're the best person to lead them out because you've been there too. And he continued to be their pastor. But that's the kind of struggle when a person like a pastor is caught between the group, church, pastor, what have you, that taught them how to do their job, and those to whom they're trying to lead. They feel that conflict from both sides, and they want to choose sides, but they're many times conflicted in how to do it. And so one of the stories that went along in the discussion forum on the internet was a guy named Richard. He was an ardent defender of greater grace, and he was posting every day. He was in Argentina, starting churches down there. And then he went silent. And I asked my contact at the church in Baltimore, what happened to Richard? And she said, don't say anything to anyone, but he's coming over to our side. And sure enough, he came over and became a strong opponent of greater grace. I have this, it's in my recovery workbook here, the roles that are played in high control groups. At the top, you have the tyrant, and then below him, you have his henchmen. And then below that, you have the enablers. They just want things to go along smooth. If there's problems, let's not talk about them. Then you have the dissidents, you have the victims, and then the dissidents at the bottom. The dissidents have said, there's a problem, and you're not going to shut me up. The enablers don't want to rock the boat. As Walter Martin would say, they have a case of non-rockabotus. And then you have the victims who can very quickly go from enabler to victim, and then from victim to dissident. And I saw a henchman in Richard go to dissident in just a couple of weeks' time. So once they see that the system is corrupt and unhealthy, they can change quickly, but it calls for courage on their part. So as Greater Grace is in this process for 2 years of wrestling with these issues, I'm writing a weekly spiritual abuse e-letter. And when it was finished, I thought, there's a lot of good material here that I don't want to just let it go to waste. And so I put together the Spiritual Abuse Recovery Workbook, which is on my table back there. It's a $9 item if you want to get one. If you are struggling right now with an issue of spiritual abuse, tell me about it, and I'll give you a copy. The first printing was 500, and I sold one. I gave away 499 because I couldn't let a dollar stand between that person and the help they needed. But I'm selling them now. So the next thing that happened was a lady came by my office in Columbus and asked me that she had heard that I had information and help on spiritual abuse. And so she came by and she described the church that she was in. It was a new startup and the pastor was controlling. And I told her the same thing. I said, get the people that are willing and wanting to come, and we'll meet at a neutral location and we'll go through the issues. Well, a man who would become a pastor of an abusive church in the future came to that class, heard all of this stuff, and didn't faze him. He went off and established his own church and has an abusive group today. But the others were helped. They realized that the abuse was not coming from Scripture, it was coming from the personality. And spiritual abuse comes from one of two categories. It's either a doctrine, like Bill Gothard has with the umbrella of protection, your covering and the chain of command that you're supposed to be under. He thinks he gets that from the Bible. He really got it from Watchman Nee, who was drawing it from probably Confucianism. But the other source is a person who has a personality disorder, narcissistic, perfectionistic, controlling, something like that. And a church is a perfect setting for a personality like that to impact people that are trusting him for wise counsel. You're hearing right now why I don't do much in the way of public speaking anymore. My voice is going. So there were several instances under my belt of dealing with the dissidents, and I had a number of individuals who were calling, emailing, whatever. And I learned something in this that I would leave with you that is probably the best approach when talking frequently with someone in any cult. As Dan Dykstra said, when you talk about these abuse kind of things, you're coming in the back door. You're not coming in the front door where they expect you. You're coming in the back door and you're telling something that doesn't apply to their organization. It applies to something else. You can even say it applies to the kind of people who have a personality disorder in our church, who have a doctrine that leads to control. And so coming in the back door with these kind of things can help that person understand that they are in an abusive, controlling, toxic faith. And you can take it from there in sharing how to come out of it. But in the workbook, I talk about stages of involvement, the roles played in high control groups, the nature of legalism, true and false Christian leadership, this kind of thing. And in the back, there are about 4 personal stories in the appendix of people who have told their story of abuse. And one of them is a colleague of ours. I won't mention his name. Well, his first name is Paul. You can read that in the book. But he is a colleague who, like me, was in an evangelical church and was abused terribly. And his story is there, and several others. So I'm going to open it up. We got plenty of time here. I'm going to open it up for some questions. Oh boy, lots of them. Yes.
Yeah, so specifically with Jehovah's Witnesses, what would be a good backdoor approach? Like I was thinking the whole Scientology series that just Leah Remini had some series.
Yeah.
And we were thinking, wow, what if I could get somebody to watch that or whatever?
Yeah.
But what are some other ways to do it other than making a book?
Well, you can use Leah Remini's TV show and ask them, did you watch any of those episodes? If not, and they probably wouldn't, but suggest that they go and watch those. It's very instructive about Scientology. You know, you're talking about Scientology. You're not talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. Anything that's available that is other than what they are, that demonstrates control, abuse, legalism, kind of thing.
What if he,
Go ahead. You already had the floor.
Okay, I have the floor. What about, like, you know somebody pretty well, and you're anticipating that they might go and ask the elders or somebody up higher in authority a question? Is it okay to sort of beat them to the punch and say, hey, what if you go and you ask your elders this question? Are they going to be upset with you? Sort of like creating like a self-prophecy.
Well, they do that with your family's going to persecute you for studying with us. Yeah. Tell them that, one thing I learned you can name some other group that you've studied about how questioning leads to the person with the question being in trouble, is that, you can't ask questions. If you can't ask questions, you can't learn. You can't even correct yourself. You can't even come to the point of understanding where you were wrong. One of the lines from Jeff Van Vonderen is, if you say there's a problem, you become the problem. And so, that kind of thing, that if you're told to, just accept what the organization says and don't question, that will ring in their ears. So that's an idea. You had a question back here?
It's the saying that I'd rather have questions that I can answer than answers I can't question. I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question.
Yeah.
You're, David, were you in the JW?
No.
Okay.
I was raised in a Christian family.
Okay. Never the Mormon?
No.
Okay. So, but you help Mormons too? Like preach to them and or talk to them and try to help them?
Yeah, the very first time they were coming by our apartment, I was trying to witness to them with limited success until later. And then they wouldn't come anymore.
Okay.
I tried to find my mission field by staking out a Kingdom Hall on a Saturday morning, follow them to their field service, and then go ahead of them with tracts on people's doors. I'd put the tract on the door, ring the doorbell, and leave. And they'd come out and, oh, here's a tract. Says, soon Jehovah's Witnesses will be coming through your neighborhood. Oh, there they are.
Yeah, you would have made a great Jehovah's Witness. I don't get very many chances to ask this, if at all, but as a Christian, what drives one or you to do what you do for these people like us?
It was entirely of the Lord. Paul had no intention or desire to go to the Gentiles. The Jews were God's people. He was to serve God with the Jews. But God revealed to him that he was going to go to the Gentiles. So he was obedient. It's just what God put in my path, and he gave me the passion to do something about it. And that passion turned into a burden, and 40 years later. So, yes.
So you mentioned Watchman Nee, which you and I know, his name is mentioned very often within mainstream Christianity. And I agree with you 1,000% what you said about him, having read him and studied him. So how prevalent have you found this as well, if I might use the term, within orthodoxy, within Orthodox Christianity? This isn't just a problem with Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. Right. I think it's more so, but what are your findings within the body of Christ, like the Bible speaks and some of those other things that took place?
I think that it's pandemic. I don't know a word that is more appropriate than pandemic. Some of it is doctrinal when you get into some of the denominations that claim to hear directly from God, and they are in an apostolic role with the members of their church. That just breathes authoritarian kind of mindset. But others, there's a book out there called Broken Heart, Shattered Trust by Ed Setzer, not Stetzer, Setzer, S-E-T-S-E-R. And he was an associate staff at a mega church, and the senior pastor was a narcissist, perfectionist. And it was a living hell for all the associate staff because they couldn't do anything right. And he was giving his book away for free. I don't know if he still is or not, but the idea is for associate staff to read that, to set them free and help them to rebuild the vitality of their faith and perhaps move on in ministry somewhere else. But so many people, when they're wounded like that, they leave and never come back. I dedicated this booklet to the friendly fire casualties in God's army, people who just wanted to love God and serve Him.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, you got a second question. I don't know if you can have a second question or not. No, I'm right.
I never touched it. I never opened it. The water's good. In my research, I'm finding that the cult leaders are either psychopaths or they're all narcissists, and then they have henchmen who are, if they're narcissists, they're controlled by the leader. In your research, have you seen evidence of that as well? especially in the Watchtower and in the Mormon hierarchy?
Let's take the Mormons and JWs and their founders. Both were very charismatic personalities. They naturally gathered a following. But when their successor came along, the successor was not like them. He was very authoritarian, very controlling, very hardline. Brigham Young and Judge Rutherford. So if a group does not have either a dynamic personality coming in the second generation or a controlling authoritarian person, then it's likely to fade away. I'd have to think for a while to come up with some, but I think that's the case. The Way International might be an example of that. And of course, a lot of the New Age or Eastern religions like Sri Rajneesh, when he passed away, there wasn't a dynamic second in line. But y'all know examples from your own ministries of that kind of thing. Yes, David?
Have you noticed any major changes since the headquarters has been relocated from the Brooklyn Bridge to the new location? Have you seen any major developments within the
That move by itself does not bring any indication, but they built on a toxic dump waste dump. Where was Jehovah when you needed him? And it sure feeds into the idea that they're liquidating a lot of their assets in order to pay costs and fund the organization with the loss of membership and so on. I don't have any statistics on any of those. I hear the stories, but they're anecdotal until there's a bigger picture that can be drawn.
Thank you.
But I think now is an opportune time to reach ex-witnesses, disillusioned witnesses. The internet is the tool, and a good presentation on the internet is a must. And it must be uncompromised with any distractions from the gospel. My voice is shot, so I'm going to quit. Thank you.